Thanks. Actually, that might make sure mine is on do not disturb. So there we go. All right. So, all right, Swamiji, thank you so much for being here with me today, and welcome to a Curious Yogi podcast.
Oh, you're very welcome. I'm happy to be here.
So, my main incentive really for inviting you on the show was, like I mentioned before, to help myself and the listeners to really understand the basis and profundity of Vedanta, which in a way that's clear and approachable, which I know that you have the capacity to do that. So I definitely want to get into that. But
Right.
to start with, I know you have such an unusual background, and I think it could be helpful for the listeners and interesting to kind of hear how someone such as yourself kind of comes onto this path in a way that's so devoted, like moving from kind of the business world, I believe, right, to taking the monastic order and living your life in service, I guess, of Vedanta. Like how did you get here in a Cole's Notes version?
Right. I think when I was a child, one of the things that really perturbed me was the wars. There were so many wars. Secondly, there was so much pain in the world and suffering. And I'm like, why is it that we are born to suffer? And it seemed like everybody was suffering on different levels. We can talk about the global level, and then we can come back to a political level in our countries, and then we look at families. We look at our own relationships with our parents and our siblings and our loved ones, and all you see is really suffering. I think Buddha also felt the same way, and he tried to do something about it. In my case, I remember as a child saying, "Oh, you know what will help is that we need to have. I would like to make a lot of money, so then I can use that and put it into social projects that I think will work, because the political system is really not very effective." And so my goal was to make a lot of money. But then while I started doing that, I realized making money is easier than actually implementing it in projects. So I found it was harder to give money away so that it can be utilized in the right way. In fact, most of the time when money is given away, it's abused, and the objectives that they originally intended never materialized. And on the contrary, it actually was detrimental to society. I saw a lot of foreign aid come to Africa, for instance, where I was born, and it basically, well, although it was financial aid and I would say economic aid, a lot of that turned to spread AIDS, the disease. So I would say AIDS spreads AIDS, foreign aid spreads AIDS. So I came to that conclusion. At some point after I graduated, I also worked in the international development field, and I found that it was an incestuous relationship between the donors and the recipient of donor. So that wasn't helping. And long story short, after my work in venture capital, international development, I realized there's got to be something more. I then got into Greek philosophy and Greek astrology. And when I was studying that, I began to realize a lot of what was spoken on by Aristotle, Plato, and Socrates actually came from the Vedas. So now I became interested in the Vedas. The problem is that when you talk to especially a lot of our Indian speakers, they convolute it in a way that makes it so confusing, and it's not clear. So growing up in America, I had a lot of Westerners who had presented Vedas in the right way. The problem was that a lot of these so-called experts, global experts, they're so famous, they've written a bunch of books, they're very widely known. The more and more I started working with them, I began to realize that something was missing. And so at that point, I had a foundation in California. And in that foundation, I began to realize wait a minute, what these famous guys with their famous books is not quite right. And I didn't know what that was. So I had a choice, and I went through this personal crisis where I decided to actually get out of the Vedic world or the nonprofit world or the spiritual world and get back in the real world and make a lot of money. But I said, hey, that's coming back to square one, because I made a lot of money and then lost it. And I realized that actually that's not the solution. And the other personal factor in my case was I know that what makes my life interesting is learning. I'm a perpetual student. And I figured out most of the things in the world, except I began to develop an interest in the Vedas. So I was like, in order to get the Vedas, I need to find a guru, which I was at that point anti-guru, anti-Swami, anti-Hindu, all of that. And so it took me quite a lot of months to get over that. I closed down the organization that I had, which was promoting the Vedas, and I decided to sort of wait for a teacher or find a teacher, a guru that would guide me. And in order to get into the Vedas, you need to know Sanskrit. Without Sanskrit, it's not possible to know. And this was one of the greatest problems that a lot of the authors had who had written most of these books. And then there was this statement that said, there was this statement that I always came across, which was, when you are ready, the guru shows up. So I had this idea that I was going to take a year sabbatical and go to India, travel around and interview all these gurus, and then find out, someone who speaks English. I didn't care if it was a male or female, and study with that person. And I realized, that's not my life. I don't know anything about India. I don't speak any Indian languages. And the idea of traveling around in India in trains and going to ashrams, I thought that was ridiculous. And so I said, let me test this out. And I said, well, if I'm supposed to have a guru, the guru will show up. So I closed down everything, and I never had a vacation for a long time. I then decided I always wanted to explore Vancouver, BC. And so I went to Vancouver, rented an apartment for 3 months, did absolutely nothing, hung out with my friends, went to Whistler, and just, relaxed, went on hikes, and had a great, great, great time. And all of a sudden, I get an email from my guru, who became my guru later on. And that was a fascinating story in itself. Um, and that's how I kind of embarked on this journey, because I really was trying to find a solution to the suffering in the world. And at that time, when I met my guru, it was mostly for my selfish interest of doing something for the rest of my life where I would be learning something. I figured that's what keeps me going. And but then my guru, who happened to be one of the greatest Vedanta teachers in the world, um, started presenting this knowledge in a way that was so easy to assimilate. It was direct. He was not making up stories. He was referring to the text. And he also addressed a few questions that I had at that time in a very clear and straightforward manner without getting too mystical or too technical. Anyway, long story short, I became his guru. He sent me to India, and I studied for 4 years in a very traditional way. I was kind of seconded up in a forest of snakes and scorpions, and for 3.5 years, I kind of lived a completely different life, which was so foreign to me. And I remember the first time I went to the ashram, I was like, "Oh my God, I've traveled around the world. I've been with so many cultures." But coming to an ashram culture was like coming to another world that was so alien that it didn't even seem human. You know? And since I got into the Vedas, I began to understand Vedanta. But then I also had other studies before. I studied Vedic astrology, Ayurveda, Vastu, and yoga theory, because that was what I was promoting with my organization in California. That Vedanta then brought all of it together. And it gave me a greater, deeper insight as to how all of these are all tied in together. And it gave me a greater appreciation of of the Vedic knowledge. So since then, since I would say 2007, I've been trying to share this knowledge with people. But a lot of people are really invested with their gurus or their systems of learning that it becomes hard for them to suddenly switch roles because some of the things that the scripture says is contrary to what they have studied for decades. And basically, I found that coming into the Vedic culture or the Vedic knowledge base is where I began to understand the workings of the universe. In fact, there was a person in England who said, she goes, "You're the only person I know who has the secrets of the universe." I was like, "Oh, I didn't look at it that way, but yeah, it kind of makes sense."
Wow. Wow.
That was a quick
A quick
summary of how
a
I,
quick
how I
lifetime
came to
and
this. Yeah.
Wow. Well, you
Yeah.
said so much there that really sparked my curiosity. And like I can so relate to that feeling of you expressing being a younger person and wanting to kind of solve the suffering in the world, because I really find in my own study and contemplation, it's something that again and again brings me to like a point of rubbing in my own practice, that why is there suffering and how to get out of the suffering on an individual level and on a macro level. So I really want to go into that more because I want to know the answer, and I hope that I'm sure you found the answer for yourself. But also when you were just speaking about how you studied like Ayurveda and Vastu and Vedic astrology, and you mentioned that there was a thread, and I'm really curious to hear what your perspective is of what is that thread, that Vedic thread or that Vedic knowledge base that you said, that kind of, what is the thread?
So the short answer is the thread is oneness, that we're all one, and everything emanates from that oneness. Now the question is, okay, so that's the same source, and to the example I give is that we know, for instance, all water in the world, in every form, whether it's a vapor or it's a lake or a stream, snow, ice, hot water, and all the fluids, you know, beer, alcohol, sewage, urine, all of that has H2O in it, right? So the base is H2O. Every liquid form has H2O, basically. Not sure whether I'm scientifically correct with that, but you can take it that most liquids are based on H2O. And so then you have all these superimpositions on the H2O that gives us the variation. Okay, you can still have H2O as an ocean. You can still have H2O as a lake, as a pond, as a stream, as a hurricane, as a tsunami, but it's all H2O. And that's kind of exactly what Vedanta teaches. And it says that everything is one. And all of this myriad of forms that we see emanates from that same form. It's just the same form in different, the same same one consciousness that is manifesting in various forms that we see.
Mm-hmm. And then like from a, because from how am I'm going to try to frame this in a sort of spiritual or existential contemplation. I'm just speaking from myself. Maybe the listeners have had a different experience, but in the experience of meditation, that makes sense. To me, oneness makes sense where there is no kind of divide. And yet, and I guess this is probably going to come up again and again as we talk, because it is the kind of eternal question, but how do we apply it practically? How do we apply that vision of oneness outside of our spiritual, contemplative, private practice with ourselves?
So the Bhagavad Gita is an incredible document that exemplifies how do we take this one principle of oneness and and deal with it, because it presents it in a worst case scenario. And what is the worst case scenario? It's the war. Okay, so it's not a war between let's say, one clan against an enemy clan. It's a war against a person who is fighting with his brothers and sisters, or mostly his brothers. But in this case, if you look at the Bhagavad Gita war, Arjuna is fighting his cousins. He's fighting his guru. He's fighting his uncle or his granddad who nurtured him, who made him who he is. So it's presenting this in a worst case scenario. So in our daily life, if I want to kill, it's like saying, here's a knife, and now you're supposed to kill your brother, or you're supposed to kill your child, or you're supposed to kill your parent. How are you going to do that? And that's the worst case scenario, because if you had to kill a person you love, not your enemy, and you have no choice but to do it, how are you going to do it? Because if you can address that situation, which is the worst case scenario, then you'll be able to deal with every aspect of life. And so Krishna talks about it, and it's very complex. And when we look at Arjuna, for instance, he's a very enlightened being. He was a great being. He was quite skilled, very scholarly, and yet an exalted being like Arjuna could not understand it. How is it that we're going to understand it? Because Krishna had told him everything in chapter 2. But he kept asking questions. And so instead of 2 questions, instead of answering it, instead of understanding it right away, we have 18 chapters. And for someone who's studying Bhagavad Gita, it became a torture, because if he got it in the first one, we didn't have to study all those other chapters. Because studying all those other chapters wasn't easy. But because it is not so easy, there was 18 chapters. But the summary of it all is that a lot of things happen because of karma, but at the same time, what is important to do is to follow dharma. Okay, so we do that in terms of our transactions. So you do what is right. The question is, how do you know what is right? And the way you know what is right is because you have the guidance of the Bhagavad Gita, or you have some guidance of the ancient texts. But the fundamental principle in all of that is you and I are one. Everything is one. It's like my right hand chopping my left hand. It's like one body part. Because if I look at my own body as this identity of a Swami, then I say, oh, my right hand hates my left hand, and so we start battling, and we start hurting each other, and then we start killing each other. So what happens is I lose both my arms, which is not very useful. A lot of the conflict in the world is really based on our ignorance. And if we understand this oneness principle, then you begin to realize that, some of the conflicts are not so important. There are conflicts that are important for our personal growth, but on the other hand, most of the conflicts we have with people, with our loved ones, with our families, they're really insignificant, and we make much ado about it rather than try to resolve it. So when you begin to understand this teaching, there's a great inner transformation. And that inner transformation makes you okay with the world the way it is. You don't need to change anything. What happens is in this journey is that you change. And because you change, the world changes. So you don't try to change the world outside, you change you. And when you change you, the world changes.
Mm-hmm. I love that, thinking of how, like, it's almost like the fog, or I think there's the analogy in some of the scriptures, like the veil gets removed, or I like the image of, like, we have to kind of clear the vision, the path, so that
Right,
the lens, so the vision of
right.
oneness can open. And I do see that as a kind of ideal, and yet I still see that I struggle with the consistent application. And when you were speaking about the Bhagavad Gita, I was thinking about, I'm not sure which chapter it is, but I think Arjun is kind of almost getting it, and then Krishna kind of shows him the whole world through his mouth, and he's kind of showing every possible like the whole everything that could be possibly manifest. And Arjun he goes back, he says, oh no, put it away, I don't want to see it actually. And that's sometimes how I feel in my own practice. Like, I'm starting to see the vision of oneness unfolding in the way that I move through the world, and then it's almost too much to bear sometimes. So it's like I just put the veil back over for myself.
Yeah, so to really understand the vision of oneness, it's really hard to do if you don't have proper training because it's so hard. The point is that we live in duality. Our constant, from the time we wake up till we go to bed, we live in the realm of duality. And so we have to understand how to contextualize that. You cannot do that without the teaching of Vedanta. The problem is you cannot read Vedanta. Okay. There are a lot of Vedanta teachers today that exist everywhere, especially on YouTube, and that's not the way you're going to get it. A lot of Vedanta teachers actually make up their own stuff, which is one of the challenges I had when I was doing all the Vedic stuff in California with our foundation. It's really important because you see at the core of this whole process of trying to understand the existence and understand oneness, because existence is really one. You have to come to a point to say, okay, so this person says that. How do we know he's true? It is correct. You know, he might feel it is correct, or she might feel it's correct, but how do we know that that person is correct? Because when a person makes an opinion, their opinion is based on their upbringing. The mind is so limited that the mind is programmed from for a person's mind is programmed from the childhood, from the time they were born, and in fact, even during pregnancy. There are impressions even from past life that comes into that whole thing. So what you have is when a person creates a system or a knowledge base, is that they do that from their limited view. Okay. Now, one thing I really appreciate about the Vedas is that the Vedas were not created by the human mind. Okay. It was information that was transmitted. So the question then becomes is how do we know that's true? And when you start studying the Vedas, you begin to realize that all of the fields that they talk about in the entire realm of the Vedic scriptures, that everything that is said in the Vedas is true without any contradiction. When you read different aspects of the Vedas, you'll find lots of contradiction. But if you understand the context, then there's no contradiction. Okay.
Mm.
So the more and more I've engaged with the Vedic body of knowledge, the more and more I began to realize, oh my God, this is really incredibly amazing because it's revealing things that we, with our human mind, have no access. I mean, pets have more access to sight and sound than we do. Right. So how is it possible that to say that, oh, we are the most intelligent creatures and therefore we know everything? We don't. So when we then rely on this body of knowledge, which has consistently proven to be accurate, then we say, okay, let me try to understand it. The problem is, in order to understand it, you need two things. And the Vedic scriptures talk about it, especially in Vedanta. One is that it's really important to understand the teaching. Okay, so it's really a way of studying in a very systematic way that would help a student. Sorry, that's my phone, but it will go off soon. A student can understand the teaching accurately. So, for instance, if I want to be a surgeon, it is important for me to go to medical school. And also, when I go to a medical school, the question is, which medical school? If I go to a medical school under a tree just because there's a nice, beautiful sign and I like the teacher because the teacher is really charming, I connect with the teacher, but the teacher is not trained in medicine. Okay, there's no way I'm going to be a good surgeon. I could harm people. But if I go to a medical school that has a great reputation and the students that graduated from there are doing incredibly well in the medical community, then I know the training is really good. So if I say, okay, I'm going to Harvard Medical School, immediately everyone respects that. And then I say, oh, I'm a Harvard graduate and I'm a surgeon, immediately that's a license to say, hey, you're really good. Okay. To deal with Vedanta, we need to go through the same processes. You need to understand a teacher. You have to study with a teacher who has been trained in the right way to teach the Vedas. Okay. If the teacher doesn't have a traditional teaching methodology, then there's no way the student will understand. And this is one of the greatest problems we have today, is that because everyone can just teach and say whatever they want, we don't have a system like we do in the West that can sort of like institutionalize the way of studying Vedanta. Everyone, even in Bhagavad Gita, for instance, everybody makes up a story. Okay. And a lot of the stories are not quite accurate. And that is because people did not study the right way. Now, when you study the right way, that means you have the text. You don't believe someone's words, a person's words. You follow the text that was written in Sanskrit and translated accurately, number one. Number two, you need a teacher who has been trained to teach. So the teachers at Harvard who are going to teach me medicine, they too have been trained in the right way. Now, when that happens, then the student can clearly understand. So without having a properly trained teacher, not taught in the right way, because I cannot jump and just take random text, you have to start from the beginning in the right way and do that. So once you go through that whole process and you have a proper way of teaching, a proper teacher, a proper student who is interested in, then you begin to understand, okay, now I get it. So it's not mystical, it's not mysticism. It's so clear. It's like, day and light. If it is taught well, if it is understood well, then the person sees the oneness at all times. You do not have to alter your state. You do not have to meditate. You do not have to shift your what you're doing. You can be super angry, you can be super happy, but still see the oneness at that time. Now, when you get to that point, then your whole transaction in life is based on that oneness. You don't waver. Sorry, I went into a rather long explanation because
No, that
this is
was great.
something, this was something I had to deal with because being in the West and especially in California, you get to see so much of this, spiritual talks that actually makes no sense at the end of the
Mm.
day. And for me, who was trying sort of like, I have an engineering mind, so I was like, you have to show it to me. Just don't tell me stuff. And then when I came to the Vedas, I began to see, oh yeah, oh my God, here it is. So since I came into this realm, I've been content and happy and just trying to share whatever I know with whoever is willing to listen. Unfortunately, people are so preoccupied with their lives that this is not a priority. So they continue to wallow in their misery, as the Bhagavad Gita says.
Yeah. Well, that's really interesting that you paint the picture of how to step into studying the Vedas. And it kind of leads me to my next question, which is like, where is the space for one to study that's, say, still in the householder realm, that still has a life or a profession or a family, that isn't able to become a sannyasi and study Sanskrit in India? Like, is there a space for that? What's your thoughts?
Yes, that's exactly what I'm doing. You don't have to study Sanskrit to know the Vedas, but you need to study with someone who has studied the Vedas really well and studied in Sanskrit. So to be a teacher, the teacher needs to know Sanskrit. You don't need to know Sanskrit, number one. Number two, you don't have to be a sannyasi to be a teacher, to study the Vedas. That's not how it works. It helps. In fact, most of the time, according to the Indian culture, you study the Vedas once you give up your responsibilities, your earthly responsibilities. So you'll find with Indian families still today, they don't know why they do it, but they do it. And that is basically they get their kids married. And once the kids are married, then they go off into, they say, you go off into the forest because that's where the guru is. And when you're studying in the forest, you're not distracted by life and events of the life. Okay, but not many people can go to the forest, and going to the forest now is not very practical. But because of technology, we can do it through Zoom. Okay, so there are a lot of classes, a lot of people are offering classes that are being that are sort of taught in a way that is palatable to a modern person. And one of the things I'm doing is I teach the same way, but I also teach in a structured manner because you cannot become a surgeon without understanding the fundamentals of a human body or the anatomy, right? And so I'm doing this course in England, for instance, which is I do this course called the Introduction to Veda and Vedanta. So that's usually about 3 days, but I'm doing it for 2 days. And right now, my next course is in London on the 4th. No, I think it's a weekend of the 4th or 5th of October. It's the first weekend in October, where I'm going to introduce the Veda and Vedanta. So when you understand that context, then you can step into Vedanta by fully understanding and appreciating what this knowledge is all about. And so, in short, the answer is that there are courses that we offer, and not only I, there are many who do. We all have different teaching styles. Mine is that I prefer a structured way of learning. And so I provide the introduction, and then there are sort of like early courses that I teach. And I've been teaching a lot in Europe. I've been teaching, I was just there in August in Germany, Switzerland, and Italy. These are the places I teach quite a bit. Now I'm starting it in UK, but I do those teachings in person because we need to have that first connection. And then later on, I go on and then switch it into the Zoom mode or through Teams or through internet. So that was one of the greatest things, is that we have technology. So people can study, on a regular basis through internet.
Mm-hmm.
And
That's
then occasionally, at least once a year, we gather somewhere in person, and because at the end of the day, you need to have that one-on-one connection with a teacher. It doesn't work just not being connected with a teacher to get
mm.
this knowledge.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'll definitely get the link from you and put in the show notes for those that are in London for the courses and all the great offerings that you have. But I want to like dig a little bit more like obviously for those that are listening, and I myself hear very clearly what you're saying, how important it is to have that trusted teacher that is qualified. But for those that are listening, are there any kind of, I know you can't like skip above, but like any high level points or things that we can start to integrate or start to think about in the way that we view the world, the way that we view our lives from the perspective of the Vedas, like just to give us kind of a teaser of what you do in your, say, your fundamentals of the Vedas and Vedic knowledge.
So I try to simplify the knowledge so that it's workable. Number one, uh, I say focus on yourself and your family and your loved ones. Okay. There's no need to worry about Ukraine or some of the problems, some of the global problems that exist in the world. They will be sorted out by people involved in it. There's always good and evil. So we don't have to deal with the evil. We have to choose the good. Okay, the evil is always going to be there. It's always been there as part of humanity. We're not going to eradicate it, and that it's not possible. What is possible is to use the good and evil for your own growth. Okay. I look at life and I see and I learn what is right and wrong. Not what is right and wrong in terms of politics, right and wrong in terms of what I do. Okay. So, for instance, you can say, oh, like here in America, there's a problem with our politics. Again, you find that that's almost everywhere now. Some people will say, oh, Trump is going to be a major disaster for America. There are other camp that says Kamala is an idiot and she's going to be the greatest disaster for America. Okay. So it depends based on your psychological upbringing. You're going to be pulled to one side of the narrative. Okay. But what has that got to do with your immediate life? Okay. You choose not to engage. Your only responsibility is to vote. Go vote. But other than that, don't even bother. You try to do good with your own families, with your own loved ones, with the people at work. You wake up in the morning, all you do is focus on doing the right thing based on what you know, of course. There's a lot that you don't know. And for that, the part that we don't know, we need scriptural teachings. And this is where gurus like us come in, or spiritual gurus come in, and they talk about what is right. Fundamentally, you know in your heart what is right, because you do not want to be treated in an unfair manner. You fundamentally want to be treated right by everyone. And the way you want to be treated is how you treat others. Okay, so once you start doing that, you'll be living a dharmic life. And if you can lead a dharmic life, then you find the universe then conspires to lead you for further studies. But if you, on the other hand, get into the negativity, get into negative actions, you see, in negative speech, a lot of what you do dictates where you go. Okay. Rather than worrying about politics that nobody understands, just because you hear the news, that doesn't mean you know. Okay. Trump may be great. Kamala might be great. We don't know. But because we're influenced by corrupt social media, we think we know. And that's unfortunate. So I've been preaching this for a long time, including during COVID times, is focus on your families, focus on your loved ones, focus on your work, do the right thing that you know how, and the rest will solve itself.
Hmm. That's great. Great life advice, I'd say, for anybody listening or not listening, for each and every
Yeah.
person. I'd love to ask your kind of, not ask, but I'd love if you could shed some light. I'm kind of switching gears a little bit, but a lot of the people that are listening are yoga practitioners. And when I say yoga, I mean mostly modern postural yoga practitioners. And many also curious seekers that are maybe not yogis in that Western context. But if you can just shed a little bit of light of the we have this philosophical system of yoga and Vedanta. Can you just share how they two intersect, or how they are one, in fact?
So I wouldn't say they are one, because yoga is in the realm of duality.
Mm,
It does. There is the advanced level of yoga, like the philosophical teachings of yoga that lead to oneness, lead to the experience of oneness. There's a flaw in that, but yoga, meditation, some of the spiritual activities that you find common in all traditions, in all religions, all of that is useful for preparation for the study of Vedanta. Now, how does that work? See, in order to really understand Vedanta, you need to have time to contemplate. And if you don't have time to contemplate, there's no way you're going to get it. But our minds are so busy that we don't have a way to know. We don't, at this stage, especially now with smartphones, we don't have time to contemplate. We don't even know what that is sometimes. What yoga does is that it's our minds are like runaway trains. How do you stop it? Okay. And the way you stop it is that because your mind is so externalized, that you kind of have to turn it inward. You have to turn the focus of the mind from outside to the inside. And the way you do that is through yoga and meditation. So it's very useful. Okay. But that is the preparation for the contemplation exercise. Now, you'll find even in Patanjali Yoga Sutras, Patanjali in the end, in his last sutra, talks about samadhi. Okay. And Patanjali Yoga Sutra is not, it's not an independent text because he starts out with atta. Atta means now. In the Sanskrit language, in the Sanskrit literature, when you say now, that means there's some text preceding it. So that means you're taking Patanjali Yoga Sutras out of context if you don't understand the full context. Okay. Patanjali Yoga Sutras is geared towards pacifying the mind. It's about the mind. It has nothing to do with yoga asana, which is the exercise. When you look at a lot of the yogic traditions and the ancient yogic teachings, it's all about changing one's behavior. You become a yogi not because you can do pretzel with your body. You become a yogi because you are able uh, to reach a point, to ascend to a place where you are not bothered by external activity, that you remain consistently the same. And this is again what Patanjali Yoga Sutras talk about. You're consistently the same in the sense that it doesn't matter whether the world is falling apart, but you are content and your mind is calm. You could be in a difficult situation, but you're okay with that. You'll fix it. I'm not saying that you ignore it. We're not talking about being passive, being a sort of like pacifist. You have to deal with the situation in the right way, following dharma, but you're not disturbed by external events. That's the difference. So yes, there is a situation. Like for instance, I have no food. I have to go do something. You can't say that I've got no food and now I have to like wait till food shows up, which a sannyasi can do. I can do that. But typically most people can't do that. Okay. If you have a flood in your house, you can't say it's time to meditate and God will take care of it. You have a flood in your house, you need to do something about saving your space. Okay, so you go around doing the things in the right way while not being disturbed by that situation. So a yogi is a spiritual practice that comes to a point where you're not driven by your desires and dislikes. In the Sanskrit terminology, you're not driven by your raga dvesha. A lot of us, all of us in human forms, we are driven by our likes and dislikes. I like this, I hate that. I hate this person. I can't stand this person. Oh, I love this person. When you go between these binary worlds of love and hate, then you're not a yogi. A yogi is a person that does not have these extreme feelings of love and hate. You love, you have compassion. As a yogi, you have tremendous compassion, but there's no feeling of hate or dislike. There's a lot of acceptance. So you'll find that the yogic practices of adjusting the mind, because at the end, the mind is the problem. So your life purpose is to organize your mind in a way that you are content with everything, with what you have. And when you can reach that point, then now you are qualified to actually assimilate and understand, actually the other way, understand and assimilate the words of the Upanishads or Vedanta, which then says we're all one. Because if you have those feelings of love and hate, or particularly hate or dislike, then you will not be able to understand the oneness. Okay. So you have to get to a stage where you transcend your likes and dislikes. And when you can transcend your likes and dislikes, then you are qualified now to appreciate the teachings of Vedanta.
Hmm. Interesting. So what I'm hearing you say is like we use the practices of yogic practices or spiritual practices because you said the problem is the mind, but it's almost like we have to sort of train the mind to then realize the knowledge which is beyond the pairs of opposites which exist in
Right.
mind body. But in order to transcend the mind body, there does have to be a kind of moving towards the sattvic qualities, but eventually
Right.
we transcend beyond even sattva, beyond even good, the idea of goodness versus
Right.
badness.
Yes. Because when we talk about good or bad, it's duality, it's binary, it's not oneness. When we talk about good and evil, that's binary, it's not one. So, for instance, when I teach in Germany, I say you have to be okay with Hitler because Hitler is you. You know, if somebody murders your child, you have to be okay with that person because that's what oneness is. You cannot say I'm one, but I dislike and hate that person. Okay, so Hitler was a problem. Okay, but you and you find culturally, I find in Germany people don't even want to mention his name. And with my German students, I go, I bring that up a lot. I say you have to reach a point where see Hitler as part of you.
Mm-hmm.
You can't say that we're one, and that means this is sort of what I say mostly in California is like if you love somebody, oh, we're all one, but the moment somebody does something, then you get really upset. And I'm like, I'm not talking about California oneness. I'm talking about a oneness that means everything is inclusive. So even the evil is inclusive. Yeah. So in the oneness, there's no binary. So the way you transcend the binary is you first look at your own feelings of love and hate. You look at your own mind, how it drives you, because actually it's not what is right or wrong at the end of the day. Well, it is based on how you grew up. What is the programming? Like, for instance, what is right in the West is wrong in India. Or what is right in India is wrong in the West. Okay, a simple thing as, greeting someone. So for instance, in the West, when I greet a woman, I hug her or we hug, right? I go to India and you don't hug women, you hug men. Okay, so people of the same sexes hug. You come to the West, you hug opposite sexes, not the same sex. Nor typically you shake hands. So starting from that, okay, everything is different. And that's all contextual. It's all based on how you grew up. What was the programming that you received? That dictates to you what is right or wrong. But in reality, there's nothing right or wrong. There are certain things as a human person that is wrong. Okay, harming another person is wrong. Harming the environment is wrong. Harming any other planet is wrong. But you pay the price for it because karma takes care of it. Okay. And when you understand that, then you start saying, okay, how do I lead a life where I do not create negative karma? Okay. And once you start doing that, now you're really on the spiritual path. But you can't be on a spiritual path and be holier than thou. And then on the other hand, say, oh, well, they are wrong and I'm right. Because the more and more you grow and the more and more you understand, you begin to realize you're not right. And what is right is that we're all one. So, you know, you have to come to that understanding. It's a cognitive process. It's not a mystical process. It's not a magical process. And to get into that cognitive understanding, you need a teacher that can cognitively train you to reach that point.
Mm-hmm.
And this is
Well,
one of the greatest drawback and particularly in the Indian tradition or in Indian spirituality, whether you talk about the yogic realms or you talk about the tantric realms, is that people get into all of this mystical talk, and they do that because they don't fully understand the cognitive part of it. It's
mm-hmm.
really, really you have to use your cognitive mind to be able to see the oneness.
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately, people are not trained. And so then, we resort to, as a default, to mysticism that cannot be proved or that cannot be validated. And in mysticism, you don't train others, you don't transfer the knowledge. When it's cognitive, you can transfer the knowledge. So as a student, I see what my guru teacher taught me. I see what my guru sees. Yeah. And this is the Vedic tradition. This is the Vedanta. It really, really teaches you in a way that the student understands. And that's why it's lasted for over 20,000 years. I mean, if it was not true, it would have died. But it is so valid because I saw what my guru taught me. I teach my students what I see. So they see what I see. I see what my teacher taught me. And so when you can have that teaching tradition, then the knowledge is transferred. And what happens with this knowledge, then it's incredibly transformative that it becomes so clear. There's no room for doubt. And in fact, I use the American legal terminology that you have to see the oneness beyond a shadow of doubt.
Mm. Nice. Well, it kind of brings me back full circle when you first expressed that feeling I could relate to as a younger person, wondering how to, as if, solve the suffering in the world. And just reflecting back on this conversation, like you said, like living our own dharma, taking care of ourselves, our family, having that qualified teacher, using our cognitive tools, our critical thinking. It's kind of like, were these all the pieces now? And have you found that you've, in your own personal practice and way you view the world, got out of that dilemma of how to end the suffering of the world?
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And that's why I've reached what I call, once I got this knowledge, which I find incredibly rewarding in so many ways. And I'll just say that it resolves a lot of our psychological problems. It resolves all the anger and hate that we have, whatever childhood traumas we've had. This knowledge kind of resolves it. It's incredible. And the other thing is that it actually contextualizes good and evil, and you transcend those binaries. So when you transcend those binaries, you come to a place of contentment because now you're at peace with the oneness. And so when you get this knowledge, not only that you resolve the the binaries, but also you resolve a lot of the psychological issues, but you also develop compassion and kindness. That okay, all those benefits puts aside. You can put that aside because at the end, what you get is this deep inner contentment that can never be taken away from you. And that's why we're called anandas, because we're supposed to be, we reach that point of bliss. It doesn't we get you don't get blissed out, but you are in perpetual state of contentment, and that's so rewarding. You then have this ability to discern between what you want to engage in, or whether the world is falling apart. It doesn't matter. So that's why what I teach with most of my students is like, take care of your own mind, take care of your own well-being, take care of what you need to do, because what you need to do is important. You cannot dismiss that. So take care of your own world first. And if you do that, the world will resolve itself.
Hmm. Beautiful. Beautiful. So much good, not even good, so many profound nuggets of wisdom and inspiration that I'm going to take from this conversation, and I'm sure the listeners are as well. And just to wrap up, I always ask my guests these three final questions. They're just quick questions, if that's okay.
Sure.
So the first question is, which scripture now currently that pops to mind first, which scripture inspires your personal practice? Or
Scriptures don't anymore because I've also transcended that. What inspires my behavior, my being is the full and complete and clear understanding of the oneness, and that's how I transact in the world. And the scriptures, I mean, I do that because of the Vedic scriptures, but you reach a point where you transcend those.
Mm. Interesting. Wow. And if you could describe your own practice, which I guess you kind of did, in 3 words, your own sadhana in 3 words.
Oh, just be who I am authentically and just serve. So I wake up every morning with no agenda. I just serve. Whoever needs help, I just help them. Some people want me to teach, I teach. Some people want advice, I give them advice. Some people want me just to listen to them, I do that.
Beautiful.
So I just, since, as Swamis, we don't have a job. We survive on donation. So a lot of it is like, okay, just serve humanity. And that's what I do. So that's my daily practice. I do have when I wake up, I do have my yoga meditation practice, which I always do. Without that, I wouldn't be essentially alive. But the meditation yoga practice are important. But my practice is how I conduct myself during the day.
Mm.
Yeah. And that
Mm-hmm.
is a yogic practice, by the way.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
You have to conduct yourself. If you're a true yogi, in the traditional sense, is not whether you do pretzels with your body. You have to do pretzels with your mind to the extent where you transcend the positive and negative, the good and evil, and you just do what needs to be done at that time for the good of others.
Mm-hmm.
Then you're a proper yogi.
Nice, nice. And then finally, can you sum up this conversation in 1 sentence?
Oh, that's your job.
Okay, fine. I will have to think about
But
it.
basically, all I can say is that there are a lot of seekers there, and I was one. And I realized that there's so many traps along the way because it's easy to fall on those traps. It's really, really hard to find the real teachings of the universe. And in order to do that, it's really important to find authentic teachers that do not teach what they think, but they teach what the scriptures teach. And they need to be trained in the traditional sense to be able to unfold the teaching in the right way. And that's, I use the example of Einstein's equation of relativity, E equals mc squared. Is energy. So you get energy from mass and light. So if you want to get energy, so you say, if you're not trained, what you would do, you'd take 1 pound or 1 kilo of a rock, because that's mass. And then you put 2 light bulbs on it. And there's no way you're going to get energy out of it. You just have 2 lights shining on that rock. There's no way you're going to convert that rock into energy. Okay. This is what happens with a lot of the scriptural teaching. E equals mass times light squared. Okay. Okay. You read that and you come up with your own creative way of doing that. So some people will use rocks, some people will use light bulbs, some people can use laser lights, some people might use different lights, different, and this is the world of spirituality. But to really understand what E equals mc squared means, you have to study physics. I studied physics in college, and I still don't get how exactly you convert mass to energy. You need a PhD level physics to understand that. You need to also be specialized to be able to understand it. And that's the spiritual journey. Okay, the spiritual journey is not going to all these weekend camps and then trying different things, because all you're doing is you're hopping from one thing to another and you're just collecting data. And then you get into some of these like no mind conferences. It's You do not go to no mind conferences. You need to deal with your mind so that it doesn't need to go into the binary world or the duality world. At the end, you have to really come back and focus on understanding the world the way it is. When you know that, then you find all of our problems disappear. It's amazing. It's almost like magical.
Mm. And yet totally practical.
And totally practical. Absolutely.
Wow, amazing. Well, thank you so much for your time, Swamiji.
You're
I
very
really
welcome.
have appreciated your wisdom and just getting to the chance to spend an hour with you. So I really am so grateful, and I'll get your all the links. If I'll get them so that I can share with the listeners to study with you and to find you and learn more.
I don't have, I'm not online so much, and I'm not on social media as much, but for the course that's coming up, Stuart has a link
Okay.
for the course. So if you don't mind adding that, because then people can go directly to his website, and I use a lot to promote other people. So this is the way I'm promoting Stuart.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah, yeah. I'll grab it from Stuart for sure then. Actually, I think I did see it on his website, so I'll pull it from there.
Yeah,
Definitely.
so and if people are really, really interested in studying Vedanta, then it's really important to come to that course that I'm offering in England, because I don't offer it that much. And then, of course, feel free to share my email if people contact you directly, and my phone number. That's okay. You can give them, you can share my contact with anyone that is interested, but they need to somehow reach out to you,
Yes.
and you can share that. So in this way, I'm also promoting you, but I don't promote myself. So
Well,
so
I'll
I think that,
definitely be promoting you and like sharing this episode with as many people as I can. And I will put the invitation for people to contact me if they're interested in getting in touch with you.
great.
And
I am on Instagram also. They can find me there, I think. But I try not to be on social media as much.
smart.
Yeah.
That's great. Well, thank you so much for your time again, and I wish you a beautiful day. And
Yes,
I'll send you an email when I post this episode,
sure.
and if then you have it. I don't know if you want to share it or listen or
Yeah, sure. I
anything.
can share it. Happy to
And
share.
yeah, I really, 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 really appreciate it. So thank you so much.
You're very welcome. Lots of blessings to you and what you do, and hope to meet you in person at some point.
Definitely. I hope so also to cross paths with you again. Thank you so
Great.
much.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.